Chapter 12, Making the List. No one knew who was going to take all these refugees to America, and most of us Afghans didn't really think about it. I guess we assumed that the American government was going to do this thing. We were wrong about that, actually. It was a private Christian organization called World Relief, but I learned this only later. At the time, I didn't care much about details. I just wanted to know how to sign up. I confess I never saw the announcement with my own eyes. People said it was on television, on the radio, and in the newspapers, but I never saw it or heard it or read it. I couldn't read. I picked up the news from other people. Many others probably learned about it the same way, from rumor, like a coup d'etat. It was suddenly the topic of every conversation one morning. The whole neighborhood was talking about it. I kept my ears open, and that's how I learned that they were especially interested in taking widows and orphans. That's how you qualified to go. After that, up and down our street, as soon as the mullah chanted the azan for morning prayers, you heard compound doors banging open as groups of women with their children left to make their way to the nearest bus stop. At first, according to the rumors, you had to apply at an office in a posh neighborhood within the city. That was where the Americans had their operation. But so many people came to apply that the Americans could not even open their doors the first day. They looked out and saw the whole street jammed with women and children as far as the eye could see. When they tried to let in just one, the whole crowd tried to get in. The workers inside the office panicked and put their shoulders to the door to squeeze it shut against the mob. Outside, the pushing and shoving graduated to punching and pulling of hair. Women and children and the few men who happened to be there all began to raise such a commotion that the police had to come. A lot of wealthy property owners lived in that neighborhood, rich Pakistanis with marble-tiled houses and fragrant gardens. They didn't want crowds of Afghan refugees clamoring and fighting in their leafy lanes. They told the Americans to process the refugees somewhere else. We learned all this from the buzz, the rumors, and the gossip. In any case, the Americans moved their operation to a place outside the city. No bus went to that location, and you couldn't get there by walking. It was too far away. If you wanted to apply for the program, you had to get to this special place by car. Most of the refugee widows didn't have cars, but even so, every morning, you heard them leaving their compounds in droves. They were hiring jitneys to take them out of town. Right from the start, I announced that I was going to apply. The family we were living with told us to forget it. Some of the other Afghan refugees we knew in the neighborhood also scoffed at my determination. Why would they pick you, of all people, they said initially. And I said, why not me? Why not my mother? She's a widow and I am an orphan. We qualify if anyone does. And then they said, how can you even think of dragging your poor sick mother off to America, inconsiderate girl? Don't you know how far it is to America? Your mother will probably die in the airplane going over. May God not will it. And then where will you be? Where am I now, I said, that I should cling to this place? My mother, however, took what all these people were saying to heart. My child, she fretted. What have folks like us to do with America? I'm too sick to travel. I don't want to die on an airplane. Don't make me go to America to die among strangers. I don't want to be buried in their soil. I tried to tell her, Mama, America's like Germany. I've been to Germany and I know what it's like there. It's a good place, trust me. You will recover your health there. They have good doctors, and the state will help. Don't be afraid. It's better for you if we go. You will finally find some respite from all the hardships you have endured. But my frightened mother only wept. It's too late for me, she lamented. She could barely get the words out through her coughing. I don't have long to live. I don't want to turn to dust in foreign soil. Let me pass from the world here, where at least I know people. Let me be buried in this soil. That's all I ask. Then I lost my composure. What about me? I shouted. If you die, what will become of me, Mama? Who will protect me if something should happen to you? Whose house should I live in? A single girl can't live in herself in the cities of Pakistan or Afghanistan. Are you waiting for someone to marry me? Do you think that's how I will be saved, Mama? Forget it. No one is going to marry me. Here in Pakistan, if a girl has so much as a mole to mar her beauty, she gets no suitors. And you know that. If her face is not pale enough, if her eyebrows are too thick, if she falls short of physical perfection in any way. And I'm missing a leg, Mama. Who will take me? In America, it's different. There, if I'm alone, I can survive. I can live. No one will look down on me for being single. No one will attack me. The law won't allow it. There I can go to school, learn something, build a future for myself. Here, if a girl lives alone in Pakistan, it's a defect, a disgrace. They will never let me live my life here, nor am I healthy, you know. I can't go out and labor for my bread. We have to do this. I don't care what anyone says. I will do it. In your name and mine, I will go apply. In this way, I tried to sway my mother. But then these people we were living with scared her with even stronger warnings, stories they picked up from the rumor mill. This whole thing is a trick, they said. Think about it. Why would anyone take 1,000 widows to America? Think about it, you fools. Why only widows? Isn't it obvious? Because widows have no men to protect them. Widows and orphans are easy prey. Don't you know how much it costs to take a person to America? Have you ever heard of anyone getting something for nothing in this world? These people have motives. They're going to sell Farah into slavery in America. Everybody knows what's really going on. Rich Americans have already placed their orders. They want so many widows, so many orphans. Wait and see. The orphans will be sold as slaves, and the widows, the older ones, will be taken directly to a soap factory, because that's what they do with old women in America. Haven't you heard? They make soap out of them. That's what people were saying in Pakistan. Self-proclaimed experts lectured and hectored my mother. They had read it somewhere. They had seen it somewhere. They had heard it from a real authority. Americans made old women into soap. My mother trembled at such tales. She believed them. My child, please know what they're talking about, she pleaded with me. Have compassion for your poor mother. Don't take me to America, to this awful fate. Every day we argued and we both cried. I couldn't back down. I just wouldn't. I had been a star fall from the sky. I knew this opportunity was meant for me. Sometimes I pleaded with my mother on my knees, clutching at her skirts. Sometimes I just sat and reasoned with her. I described all the things I had seen in Germany, patiently, again and again. I told her not to listen to people in this neighborhood. They were ignorant. They didn't know. And at first, of course, I alarmed my mother with words like these. I, a mere girl, was calling adult men ignorant. I, a non-literate 13-year-old child, was challenging the wisdom of people much older than myself, some of whom could read. But I kept arguing from the authority of my experience. I clung to that. I had been to Germany. I had seen that world with my own eyes, and it wasn't like they said. At least I wore down my mother's resistance. She said, okay, we'll apply for this, but I'll do it. You stay home. There is no need for you to go. I said, no, Mama, you stay home. If you go, you'll have an asthma attack when the shoving and pushing starts. And what will you do then? But my mother countered, saying, no, Farah, if you go, when the pushing and shoving starts, your leg will fall off. And what will you do then? So we bickered this way, back and forth, her asthma against my prosthetic, until we finally came to a compromise. We would both go, the two of us together. I sought out a woman named Zaiba, who was organizing rides in our neighborhood. Zaiba means beautiful, and the name suited this woman, for she certainly did a beautiful thing for all of us. Zaiba knew a man who owned a Suzuki, something like a cross between a rickshaw and a real car. For a set fee, this man was willing to take passengers out to the application station in the morning and bring them back at the end of the day. Zaiba paid him his fee each night and then lined up riders to share the cost. She told people where to meet and what time the ride was leaving. The more riders she signed up, the less each rider had to pay. I put my mother and me on Zaiba's list. The next morning, a little before the appointment time, we went out and stood by the side of the road with the other hopeful passengers. We were all women, because people were saying that only widows should apply, widows and their children. Some of the women waiting with us that morning confessed that they did not know if they were widows. Their husbands had disappeared, but whether they had been killed or hauled off to a Taliban prison, they didn't know. They had, however, decided to try to go to America, although the possibility that they were abandoning their husbands filled them with doubt and anguish. The mullah had just finished chanting his call to morning prayer. The sun had not yet come up. The Suzuki came along in the dark and pulled up to the curb. This small vehicle is open in the front where the drivers sit, but it has a canopy over the back. The passengers sit behind the driver on two benches that face each other, one along this side and one along that. It seats 6 comfortably, but 8 can squeeze in. This morning, however, Ziba had signed up 12 riders. As I said, she always signed up as many as she could in order to reduce the cost per person. We crammed into the seats. We sat on the floor between the seats. We hung on to the outside, anything to get to the place where applications were being taken. The man drove us through the quiet darkness of Quetta. About half an hour after leaving the city limits, we came to an isolated compound in the middle of an open field. In Pakistan, when people develop a property, they start by enclosing an area with high walls. After that, when they get to it, they erect structures inside the walls. Here we saw no evidence of buildings inside the yard. No rooftop poked above the walls, and there was nothing else in that vicinity. No buildings, no other compounds, just the featureless road running on to some unknown destination, and the open fields and this mud enclosure. We arrived at about 5 o'clock in the morning in order to be first in line, but we were too late. Others had gotten up even earlier. Hundreds of people already stood waiting outside the gate of that compound. We had no choice but to take up our positions behind them all. Slowly the hours passed, and as darkness gave way to daylight, more and more people arrived, until at last many thousands of us stood waiting for the gate to open. As the sun rose, so did the temperature. Quetta gets quite hot in the summer, way above 100 degrees on normal days. We had no water, and there was nowhere to get any here in the desolate wasteland. But then, as the morning went along, vendors began to arrive. For wherever great crowds gather, vendors see opportunities to make money. An instant bazaar took shape along that road. People selling food, selling water, selling fruit juice, selling ice cream. But we had no money to spare, and besides, we did not want to lose our place in line. For even though hundreds of people had arrived ahead of us, thousands had arrived after us. As it turned out, being first in line didn't matter much. When the compound gate finally opened late that morning, all semblance of a line disappeared. People began jostling and shoving until the line dissolved into one big, boiling, chaotic horde. The Americans had moved their operation out here to the wilderness, but they had not figured out a way to conduct the process peacefully. The police evidently knew this. Chaos was going to break out. They must have been waiting someplace nearby, because they arrived on the scene within a few minutes to restore order. They blew their whistles and shouted commands, but no one paid any attention to them. People didn't care if the body blocking their way to the gate belonged to a policeman. They shoved the obstruction aside, whoever it was. The police swung their sticks and knocked some heads, but they were few and the refugees were many. The crowd soon overwhelmed them. Then the army arrived. These men, too, must have been standing by on alert. The soldiers fired their guns into the air, which got people's attention, and they waded in among the people, using the butt ends of their carbines or clubs. They managed to restore some semblance of order and create a separation between the crowd and the compound door. One of the Americans working inside the compound came to the gate at that point to speak to us and calm us down. "Don't fight over this," he said. "Here, we are just taking names and finding out a little about you. We will talk to every one of you. If not today, then tomorrow. If not tomorrow, then the next day. We will keep this process going as long as it takes, so be patient and let us call you in one by one." While he stood there talking, someone in the crowd threw a stone. It hit the poor man on the head and his forehead started to bleed. "Okay," he shouted, "that's it. The selection process is over. We're not taking any more people. You ruined it for yourselves." He went back into the compound and slammed the gate, and we could hear the clanking of metal as someone pulled a deadbolt into place and turned the keys in the locks. Oh, what a wailing and howling rose then from the thousands of people assembled outside that compound. For a few hours the gate remained closed. Here and there some commotions broke out, but the army men were standing there with their guns, and no one dared to go up against them. Mostly people just collapsed where they had been standing and wept and cursed whoever had thrown the stone. And the vendors moved busily among the people, selling fruit juice and selling ice cream. Finally, some of the white-haired elders among the Afghan refugees knocked timidly on the compound door and pleaded through the metal of the gate, pleaded to speak to the American officials. A few of them were admitted at last. They went inside, and I can imagine what they said. "Don't punish all the people for the transgression of just one. Look at how the people are suffering out there. Don't send them away disappointed. Start the process again." The Americans relented and agreed to resume the interviews, but only if the refugees could behave themselves. After that, under the watchful eyes of the soldiers, people tried to restrain themselves. Even so, each time the gate opened, a mass moved toward the opening like a wave gathering to crash against a rocky shore. It reminded me of the border stations between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Here, however, every time the gate opened, 2 or 3 people got through. No one had to pay a bribe. In that way, it was different from the border. People could see that slowly they actually were taking applications. So even though we got nowhere near the gate that day, we had some hope that our turn might come if we returned often enough. Well, the next morning we arrived at 4 a.m., an hour earlier than the day before. Yet again, hundreds of people had arrived ahead of us. As we talked to some of those people, we learned that most of them had been here all night. Some had arrived the night before and had camped in the field. Others had gotten here yesterday and had never departed. Once again, however, it didn't matter who had arrived early or late. It only mattered how aggressive a person was and how strong. Again, on this second day, I couldn't get to the front. I could only get close enough to see how the system worked. When the man came out, he pointed to the first person he saw. In order to be chosen, you had to be right there where his glance could fall on you. I kept trying that day, pulling my mother along, squirming and jostling our way forward, but I wasn't strong enough to compete. Once I got tired, I couldn't even hold our space. In the thickest middle of the crowd, bodies crushed in on us from every side. My mother couldn't breathe. We had to fight to move back the way we had come. Away from the door, back to where the crowd thinned out. My throat was parched and my tongue felt like shoe leather. At mid-afternoon, as often happens in Quetta in the summer, wind began to scream between the hills. These windstorms turned day to dusk with the brown dust they whipped up. Once this wind started up, we could do nothing but crouch with our backs to it, covering our face with our headscarves. That's how we all spent the next few hours, the many thousands of us assembled around that compound, men, women, children, and bawling babies. Yet the whole time, the officials in the compound kept coming out every few minutes, kept calling refugees inside to process them. On the third day, we made our way pretty far forward early on. Suddenly a man came out, and I saw that he was Pakistani, not a foreigner. "Today we're taking the wounded and disabled first," he announced, and he stood there looking out over the sea of people. His eye fell glancingly on me, and I waved my arm to hold his gaze and hobbled a step or 2 forward. "You there," he called out. "Yes, you." His stare remained fixed on me. "Come forward, girl, come." The crowd had to part to let my mother and me through. He said, "What is your story?" I told him I had stepped on a landmine as a child. My mother said nothing, standing next to me, gasping like a fish out of water, barely able to stand upright. "All right," he said. "You, too, can come inside." As I slipped past him into the compound, he picked out several others from the crowd as well. We all went through the gate. Inside the yard, I saw one small hut-like structure. Otherwise, it was just an empty field, exactly the same as the desert landscape outside. In front of the hut, a man sat at a simple desk with an open ledger in front of him and a box of papers next to him. He gestured to a row of unpainted wooden benches against the wall and went back to marking figures in his book. We sat on that bench, our hearts booming, waiting the next event, scarcely daring to believe we had actually gotten inside the compound, trying to keep our fears quiet and our hopes from going wildly out of control. At last he began calling people over one by one. When our turn came, we stood before his table. He asked our names and wrote them down. He asked where we came from and where we lived now, and he wrote this information down. He asked how many were in our family and who they were. My mother began to cry, and I told the man that it was just the two of us, that we had lost everyone else. He nodded. Then he handed me a slip of paper with some writing on it. "Sister dear," he said, "here in this yard we only make appointments. You must go to this address in Quetta for your actual interview. Go there on the day and at the time marked on this bit of paper." Since I couldn't read, I had to ask him to read me the address and tell me the time, and I memorized it. "Don't be late," the man told me, "because you won't get another chance. Be sure to have this appointment slip with you when you go, because when you show up in that neighborhood, the police might stop you and ask what you are doing there. What is your business? If you don't have this slip of paper to show them, they will drive you away. For the same reason, don't go the day before your appointment, or the day after, or on any day except the one marked on your slip. When the time comes, be ready to answer all questions about your life and your situation. If God wills it, sister, you and your mother will go to America." In this courteous manner, addressing himself first to me and then to my mother, the man dismissed us. He was a decent man. We thanked him and made our way out the back of the compound through a separate door. We had to wait a few hours for the Suzuki to take us back to the city, and we never went back to that field again, although I'm told they continued to take names there for another month or so. But we had finished that part of the process. We had no reason to go back there. On our appointed day, we asked directions to the address written on the slip of paper we had been given. Those directions took us to the agency's original office in that posh neighborhood. This time, no crowds or commotion troubled the atmosphere of the neighborhood, because no one could enter that area without an official appointment slip, and only a few people had appointments at this office at any given time. It was a stylish building on a quiet street, and if it had been a sign of any kind, I don't remember it. In any case, I was not on the lookout for signs, since I would not have been able to read them anyway. I assumed we were entering the American embassy. The Pakistani man who admitted us led the way to a room furnished only with carpets and chairs. 4 or 5 other families were there, already waiting. Our appointment slip said 11 a.m., and we had arrived with time to spare. But they didn't call my name until about 3 that afternoon. I didn't mind the waiting itself. The room was comfortable. I just had trouble holding my tensions down all that time because I didn't know what they would ask. I didn't know if they would accept us or reject us. A well-dressed, middle-aged, business-like Pakistani woman conducted the interview. "What is your name?" she asked. I told her. "And your mother's name?" I answered this. "Where are you from?" I told her, and she wrote it down. "How did you get here? What family do you have? Why did you come to Pakistan? Why did you want to go to America?" I said, "I want to go to America so I can get an education and make something of my life. Here I have no one except my mother, and she's not well. My missing leg is a problem too. I think we can both get better medical treatment in America. That's another reason I want to go, but mostly because I want to have a life." The woman nodded and jotted notes. "Okay," she said, "that's fine. But we need to talk to you again. Come back in 2 weeks. If you don't show up for any reason, you will be eliminated from consideration. Here is your appointment slip." She gave us a slip of paper with a new date and time marked on it. We came back 2 weeks later and went through the same procedure again. She seemed pleased with our answers, but at the end of the session, she said she had to see us yet again. No American ever interviewed us. In fact, it was always the same woman, and she interviewed us 4 times in all. Maybe she slipped some new questions into each interview, but if so, I didn't notice. To me, it seemed like she asked the same questions every time, and I gave the same answers. I suppose someone was drawing up a list based on these interviews. Maybe a few people were eliminated each time somehow. Perhaps some American official we didn't know was reviewing the Pakistani woman's notes after each interview. I don't know. In any case, after the 4th interview, she said, "Congratulations, you have been accepted. Now you have to go to the American Embassy in Islamabad. They must interview you too. If they say yes, then you will go to America."